Hey y'all, and welcome to Preaching in a Pandemic, What They Didn't Teach Us in Seminary. My name is Susan Sparks. I'm the pastor of Madison Avenue Baptist Church right here, as you see, sitting, talking by myself in the sanctuary because we are sheltered in place during the pandemic. And if you hear a little noise outside, they are ripping up the pavement. Welcome to New York City, so sorry about a little background noise. Today we're going to be talking about the message. This is lesson 4. Now, you may remember lesson 1 was actually, we talked a little bit about how to make the best impression on camera. Week 2, we talked about eye contact and how to connect with the audience. Week 3, we talked about bringing authenticity to our message, which is so important on a visual and a camera, a small camera as opposed to a pulpit. Always important, but most important when you get into a camera lens. And today we're going to talk about the message itself. Now, I think it was in the introduction where we acknowledged together how difficult things have become, how crazily different things are these days. I mean, before we were preaching to a community, a congregation in the pews, right? And usually people would not get up and walk out. You always hope. You always have that one person every once in a while. But for the most part, people, if they came in the door, they'd stay. Now, no deal. If people are watching on their iPhone or their computer or their television and for one split second they lose you, then click, they're in Netflix or they're at brunch or they're just reading the paper or whatever else they're going to be doing. We've got to ramp up our game big time. And there's a number of elements that we can do, number of steps that we can take in order to do that. We've hit a number of them earlier about how we deliver. Today I want to talk about the message itself. That message, brothers and sisters, has got to be as tightly crafted as is humanly possible. Way more so than before. I mean, before I know we wanted to do a good job. We wanted it to be a carefully, tightly crafted message. Now it has to be. Here's the bottom line. Human beings have a very short attention span. Time magazine actually performed a study on the digital impact on the human brain, and they concluded that adult human beings now tend to lose focus after, are you ready? 8 seconds. I mean, I'm sorry, 8 seconds? Really? But there you go. And if you do a little research, you can also find that the average attention span for, say, a goldfish is 9 seconds. So we are dealing with an audience with an attention span that's less than a goldfish. Now, no offense to your congregations. I'm sure they're lovely people. Mine are lovely people. But on the whole, people have a very short attention span. And here's what's even worse. Average people remember about 10% of what you say. 10%. I mean, think about all the hours we spend slaving on these sermons. They're going to change the world, right? No, 10%. If you're lucky, 10% is what they're going to take away. So we better decide what that 10% is up front, right? And we better tightly craft that message so that we keep their attention. And here's how you do it. In my experience, 20 years as a preaching pastor, this is what I've come up with. Your sermon, our sermons, have to preach like an EKG. Okay? I know that sounds a little weird. EKG, we all know what that is. You get a little heart test, you see the test, there's a spike, and it kind of drops, spike, drop, spike, drop. The spike marks an electromagnetic change in the heart, and that shows a healthy heart. Well, a healthy message also has a pattern of spikes. It's a pattern of changes throughout. I mean, as you know, I'm a stand-up comedian. What I've learned over the years is most professional stand-up comedians hit anywhere between 6 and 8 punchlines a minute. Think about that. That is some tightly crafted material right there. 6 to 8 punchlines a minute. Thank goodness we as preachers are not held to that kind of bar. We hit 1 punchline a minute. That's pretty good. And when I mean punchline, I don't mean dropping a joke. I mean like a really poignant, power-punched kind of comment that grabs people's attention. We have to plant spikes throughout the message because when the change, that spike happens, it brings people back. Okay? So I want to propose today that looks like 8. 4 spikes that we can use to bring people back in the message. Number 1 is our voice. Now, you know there's so many different ways one can use a voice in a pulpit or on camera. Now, one is speed. Sometimes we got to watch to make sure we're not speaking too fast, but there are occasions when speeding up your voice is appropriate. Maybe you're telling a story where there's some edge to it, there's some tension. A little bit of speed helps play into that tension. You've got to be careful to make sure you're enunciating so people can hear it, but speed can change the dynamics, make people look back up, catch what you're doing, and come back to the message. You can also change your tone. Maybe you're speaking either emotional tone, you're speaking in a jubilant way, a happy, a joyful way. Maybe the tone changes to something very serious, where your eye contact, your facial expressions, and your voice go into something that's very serious. People can hear that. That's an audible change, can bring them back. You can also change your volume. Now, with a mic, it's easier in a pulpit to come in and pull back, but even with a camera like this, you can physically up your volume or bring it down. Why would you do that? Well, sometimes if you drop your volume and you talk a little softer, then not only is it a change that brings people in, but it makes people lean in to hear a little better. It brings an intimacy to the message. Perhaps there's something that you want to share that has some emotional punch to it, a very intimate story. Drop the volume a little bit. Of course, one of the most powerful spikes you can use, number 2, is silence and pauses, which we rarely ever use. I mean, it's scary to stand in front of people, or even scarier, I think, to sit in front of a camera lens and say nothing. Just sit there. It's very hard. But yet, this is the most powerful tool we've got. Sometimes, think about it like this. Think about it when you maybe were younger and in school, and I'm sure you didn't do this, but perhaps I might have. Teachers lecturing, and you're just, doodling and not really with the teacher, and all of a sudden the lecture stops and there's silence, and you're like, oh no. And what do? You look up. The silence breaks the pattern, and it brings people back. It's also a really kind thing to do for people in a sermon, because a sermon, unlike a book, you can't highlight, you can't go back and reread the paragraph, you can't slow down or pace how you read it. You're just getting words bombarded at you, bing, 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 bing. Every once in a while, people need a moment to digest them. So not only is it a tool for us as preachers and a rhetorical tool for us as presenters, it's also a kind thing to do to allow people to hear, process, and absorb what you're saying. I think one of the most powerful beginnings I've seen in a speech or a piece in my life was when I was really young. I was on a debate team in high school, and a young woman got up. She stood in front of the audience for, I'd say, a good 15 or 20 seconds and said nothing, just making eye contact with each quadrant of the room. And then all of a sudden, she started to snap. Every 5 or 6 seconds. By this time, the room was just right with her. And then all of a sudden, she stopped. And then she said, every 5 seconds, someone on this earth dies of hunger. Whoa. Whole room right with her. And she kept us for the rest of the time because she had spikes planted throughout to bring us back. But that opening rocked everyone. And again, it was through silence and pauses. The third thing we can do, of course, is physical movement. That changes things up. Now, when you're behind a pulpit, it's a little easier. You can come out from behind the pulpit. Or if you're free mic preaching without notes, you can move around. You can move into the congregation, although that does tend to scare people sometimes. But you can move. Gestures, body movement, all of that tends to bring people back, a change from where you are. Now, on camera, it's a little tougher. You got a tight shot. It's not like I could wander over here. You wander out of the shot. That's not going to be so helpful. But you still can have kind of physical movement. You can still be alive on camera. I mean, to sit there and preach and not move your head or body is going to bore people into the floor. It's also going to look really strange, and it falls into the category we just talked about, which is the Cyborg Syndrome. When you talk to your friends or your family, I mean, everyone has a different level of movement. Some people use a lot of hand motions, some people use very little, but you've got to be natural. You've got to come across as you're just talking to somebody at a coffee shop or a bar or at your dining room table. One other thing you can do in terms of movement when you're tight with the camera is splice in some images. I've been playing around in my sermons and editing in an image that will highlight what I'm talking about. An image, a photograph, or even a little tiny quick video clip, assuming you have the licensing for it, or a little clip of music if you've got the licensing for it. Changes it up. It's a great way to spike in a change and bring people's attention back. And last but not least, of course, is the type of material itself. Now, there's been studies all over the place about all the different, pathos and logos and ethos and, okay, go read about that. That's fine. Let's just be really basic. You can have stories, you can have statistics, you can have scripture, you can have all the things that kind of fall in the logic area, you can have the thing that falls in the information area, you can have the things that fall into the emotion area. My whole point today is mix it up. So you may start your sermon with a story to bring people in. And then all of a sudden you shift into scripture. And you can talk a little bit about the exegesis of the scripture, the background of the scripture, the history of the scripture. Then maybe you morph into a current event that the scripture, brings some light to. Then maybe you come back to a story. Then maybe you hit a statistic or a newspaper headline. Do you see how this goes? It never stays. It's not one monolithic presentation on one aspect of information. It's all types of different information. Sorry, I keep scratching my nose. I don't know. I think I'm allergic to something in the sanctuary. And of course, this goes to authenticity. This is where I am right now. My nose is itching, so I'm going to scratch it. But here's the thing about the information. I want to say this one quick line about stories. Stories are absolutely the most powerful, golden tool that you've got in your toolbox. Sure, you want to be authentic to the scripture and the teachings. You want to do your research. You want to understand the background. But unless you frame it around a visual that people can lock onto, they're not going to remember it. And that's the whole ball game. I mean, if people hear your sermon and enjoy it in the moment, but then they don't go out and do anything about it or remember it on a Wednesday or put it into action or repeat it for someone else, what's the point? There is no point. Think about how Jesus preached. Everything was around a story. For a rich man to get into heaven, it's like shoving a big fuzzy camel through the eye of a needle. Something that people would understand, a familiar image, a story that they would latch onto, go back, repeat to their friends, and the story would kind of, quote unquote, go viral. Stories are golden. So that is a key piece of a spike, a way to not only bring your audience back, but help them remember what you're trying to share with them. So I believe it was in the introduction, the homework that I offered you was part of what I call an EKG test that I think is important that we do each week after our sermons. Back in the introduction, I suggested that you do a visual test. After your sermon, watch the video, watch it without sound to see how you physically present, and then watch it with an image with no sound to see, watch it with an image with no sound to see how you physically present, and then watch it without an image and only sound to see how your voice presents. Does it match the message? Is it understandable? That's one important test, but let me give you a new EKG, quote unquote, test to do at the end after your sermon. And that is to look at the actual manuscript itself. Even if you're not a manuscript preacher, surely you have notes that are down. You better, because that's the only way it's going to be tightly organized. Take your notes, take your manuscript, look at it, and mark the spikes throughout. Where you've got a change in information type, or a change in the way you're going to present, or maybe a movement, or a way your voice is going to change. Mark the spikes and see if they are consistently placed throughout the message. With human attention span as it is, like I said, 8 minutes, I would say you need a spike every 2 or 3 to ensure that that audience stays with you, that that congregation absorbs what you have to say, and at least takes the 10% away, if not more. So that's your homework for this week. And I look forward to seeing you next week when we're going to talk about something very important. We're going to talk about self-care. Now, don't go, oh, here we go, I've heard all the self-care. No, we're in a pandemic, people. And of all the times we have to stay strong, it's now. Because we have to stay strong to keep our congregation strong. And there's some ways I want to share with you that I think are unique to this time and something that you might be able to use to help you stay strong for your people as well. So take good care, take care of yourself, have a good week, and I'll see you next Monday for week 5.